there was this example from Alistair Cochrane saying, okay, we need to have reserved seats in parliament that are elected by, where animal representatives sit, that are elected by citizen assemblies. So this may sound like a really radical idea. Hi, I'm Alli, and today I'll talk about how can we establish political representation of animals in practice. And I'm from Hamburg, and I study political science, and I'm happy to be here. And before we come to this topic, I do want to start with 2 disclaimers. The first one is that in our society we do have a human-animal dualism that is reproduced in many ways, for example also by our language. So in this presentation I'll try to reflect on this aspect that animal is a constructed concept by subsuming like millions of species into one term and contrasting it to one species, the human. I believe it is highly critical to reflect on that. I use the concept anymal, written with an Y. It's a concept from Lisa Kammerer, and it means any animal who does not happen to be the species that I am, basically tries to irritate the reader and tries to really make you aware of the fact that it's a constructed concept. The second disclaimer is that this presentation will be about Western democracies and institutions within democracies, but this presentation does not want to assume that democracy is the greatest or most advanced form of organizing society and politics. I believe also from a colonial standpoint of view, it's highly critical to use these narratives. And I believe it would be a really interesting question to ask oneself, in what form of organizing society or politics would be the best for animal representation? Maybe I'll do a presentation on that next year. I do not have an answer for that yet. But this presentation is an attempt to display the spectrum of possible animal representation within democracy. So I will provide you with the spectrum of ideas and demands that will vary in their radicality, that you as an activist, you as an organization, or also you as a party can actually adopt. So this will be our agenda for today. We'll start briefly with why I believe the debate in political theory is actually important for a movement, and then we'll move on to the main part of the presentation, which is my strategy that I believe could be helpful, and also the spectrum of demands. Okay, to start with some thoughts of why is this debate in political theory actually helpful for a movement. So for a few years there has been a debate in political theory of how animals can be actually represented in our democracies, and it emphasized the necessity of actually having animal representation, but also discusses several ideas of how this representation could actually institutionally look like. To give you one example, for instance, a prominent theorist, Alistair Cochrane, said we should reserve seats in parliament for animal representatives, and then citizen assemblies would actually vote them into parliament. Just to give you one brief example. So within our movement, I believe we have a variety of ways of how we actually work towards liberating animals. I mean, we found sanctuaries, we have civil disobedience, we have animal organizations lobbying for animals and animal rights, and we have direct action, we have critical animal studies, and so on and so on. So we have so many ways, and I believe formal politics is one of the ways where we can actually work towards liberating animals. And I believe that the debate within political theory has been neglected. So currently we do have actors that actually try to represent animals in formal politics. I mean, we have many actors doing such an important work, such as animal advocacy parties, but also animal welfare organizations that lobby for animal interests. But the question is if this is sufficient, because these forms of representation are not secured. They don't guarantee an animal representation within a process, within a formal process. So we do lack institutions in our democracy that actually secure and guarantee the animal representation regardless of the public view of animal issues, regardless of the government, and so on. So I believe that political theory does demand animal representatives and also the institutionalization of it. And if we would institutionalize animal representatives, this would help our movement hugely to liberate animals, because then also, like Peter Niesen has argued, if we have animal representatives in parliament or also in other institutions, they could then fight for consensual majorities within the decision-making process to actually step by step establish animal rights and liberate animals. Okay, so these are my initial thoughts why I believe this is important. Now we'll come to the basic strategy, and this may sound like basic campaign thinking, but I believe the first step would be that organizations and parties actually have a position on how they would actually animal representation would look like, because I can speak for Germany because I'm from Germany, but in Germany most animal welfare parties and organizations actually do not know of the debate in political theory. There is within Germany only one organization, Animal Society. They're also here in the audience and they have a stall next room that are actually specifically working towards establishing animal representation, also with the background of political theory, but they're the only ones in Germany. And also I believe I've talked to parties, animal advocacy parties across Europe, they also do not know about this debate. So I believe the first step would actually be that you develop your own position on that, because if you have your own position, you are empowered to respond if institutions within your country are under attack. And then in the next step, you're actually also able to actively communicate your position to the public, or also in formal politics and include it in your lobbying. And we would do this in order to overall change the overtone window, also basic campaign thinking. Overtone window is like the window of where change is possible. You also see a picture up there where like we have these two extremes of things and ideas being unthinkable or too radical, and the overtone window is the place in society where actually change is possible, and we can then ultimately change the overtone window of maybe really radical ideas from political theory, such as reserved seats in parliament for animal representatives, to make them actually more acceptable and less radical, and then ultimately change policy and establish animal representation. But in order for all of this to happen, we need to develop your own position, and this is what the main part of my talk will actually be about. Is about strategy and progress. So these are also initial thoughts. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that. I would propose that if you start to develop your own position regarding that topic, that the first question you could ask yourself is, are there any formal institutions that try to articulate animal interests in your country? And this is regardless of political level. It's also regardless of how powerful these institutions might be. So there may be institutions existing in your country, but maybe they're weak ones. But still ask yourself that question. And if you come to the conclusion, no, there are actually no institutions in your country or whatsoever, I propose that you ask yourself if there are any other institutions that represent other marginalized groups within your country, also regardless of political level. And because if there are any other institutions that already exist, are the marginalized groups, like for example children, future generations and so on, you can ask yourself if can they be applied to the representation of animals. To give you a brief example, last year when I spoke here, one audience member, I unfortunately do not know the name anymore, I don't know if this person is present or not, but someone told me that in Northern Ireland they have the Commissioner for Children and Young People, so basically an institution that tries to make the interests of children, young people more present in political decision making. And actually they are currently trying that this framework that already exists and is successfully implemented in their country, that this is applied to the representation of animals. And I believe this is the less radical step of how you can start your position to look, are there any other institutions that are already successfully implemented? And then you can work towards that these are actually applied to animals. If, just to remind yourself, I just asked you the question if there are any institutions in your country. If your answer to that question is yes, there are already existing institutions, I believe the first step to actually would be part of your position is to prevent the weakening of these existing institutions, and then in the second step to strengthen them in their rights and in their independency. And I have 3 examples from Germany that may be helpful for your country as well. Partly I think they can be applied to other countries, partly maybe not. And I will start with the first example, the animal ombudsperson. So maybe you've heard of this institution before, because ombudspersons more generally is a really is an institution that is applied in many countries across Europe on many political levels. So in Germany, we have several animal ombudspersons within federal state level, but also state level. They're basically tasked to provide new input into legislation process, but also write reports and do public duties and so on. And so basically, regarding the first step of preventing the weakening of institutions, the most recent example from Germany is actually that Katrin Herrmann, who's also in the audience and doing important work, is the animal ombudsperson from the federal state of Berlin. And the government basically said that everyone had to cut their expenses by 2%. So had to cut their funding by 2%, and the CDU senator for justice, so CDU is a more conservative, more right party in Germany, decided that the animal ombudspersons need to cut their funding was cut by 96%. So everyone had to save 2%, and the animal ombudsperson's funding was cut by 96%, which basically makes the work impossible, and there has been protest against it, also organized by Animal Society. So in this context, the first step would actually to work towards prevention, to prevent the weakening of institutions that already exist. So institutions such as ombudspersons are also discussed in political theory. For instance, Beckmann and Okla, some theorists talk about them. They say ombudspersons may sound rather like a more weak institutions because what the ombudsperson says is not legally binding, or they can't veto like laws, but still maybe there's also a lying potential in these institutions because they are already implemented successfully, so they have a maybe higher probability to also implement them in your countries. But also there's a potential that if they're not legally binding, also governments agree easier to actually implement them. But apart from this, actually there are so many ways of how we could strengthen the institution of an animal ombudspersons. Time-wise, I can't present you the study, but Henny Poppinger, also a friend of mine who's also present in the conference, wrote their master thesis about it and did interviews with several animal ombudspersons in Germany and actually developed many recommendations of how their work could be more effective. So part of one's position could be like a detailed enumeration of all the things that would actually strengthen the work of an ombudsperson. To give you just some example would be to protect them more from the government, to make them more independent from the current government, more rights to access files, more rights to speak in plenary sessions, more rights to sue, and so on and so on. These are also demands that are advocated for by Animal Society. To move on to the second example, which is Animal Protection Ministry. So in Germany, we don't have one, but so in Germany, animal welfare is basically part of the Ministry for Food and Agriculture. So you can imagine that conflict of interests are inevitable between animal welfare and advocacy and agriculture interests. So organizations have long been demanding to outsource this part into animal welfare into the Ministry for Environment, or actually establish a ministry for itself. So I believe this is an example that also can be applied to other countries, just to basically see what structures and institutions do we already have and how can we advocate for strengthening them. The last example I have may be a more German-specific one. It's about Tierschutzbeiräte. I have a new slide for that. This term can't be really translated well. I try to translate it as animal welfare advisory boards. So basically we have Tierschutzbeiräte in Germany on federal state level and also on state level. And they are basically a board consisting out of animal advocacy organizations, representatives of different science fields, but also economic interest groups such as the farmer unions, the hunting associations, fishing industry, and the zoos. And their main task is basically to advise governments. So they come together, they deliberate about some issues, and then they write reports and they recommend things to the governments. So Philipp von Gaal, a friend of mine, they conducted a study about them, and I co-authored that study, and the study will be published soon. So unfortunately, it's not published yet, but I still will use this as an example. So in this study, Philipp von Gaal did interviews with members, with animal advocacy members within these boards, and they actually developed many demands of how the work of these boards could be made more effective and made more towards representing animals. And I will present you now one demand that was developed in that study, which is that the study demands the composition of these advisory boards as a two-tier model, so that they are their composition is done in 2 steps. So that the first step would be that representatives of civil society, so animal welfare rights organizations, come together with science representatives. They will deliberate and they will show their position to the government. And in this first step also, still currently maybe minority views within an animal advocacy should also be represented in that board, because currently governments just say, no, we don't want minority positions, so more radical positions are sometimes, like more radical positions regarding animal rights, are excluded from these boards. So the study says, okay, we do need to include them also. And then only then in the second step, subgroups can be formed with these economic interest groups, like I said, like the farmers' unions, the hunting associations, and so on and so on. And then they can deliberate with each other and also find compromises, because currently it is in many boards the case that actually the economic interest groups outweigh the animal advocacy interests, which does not make any sense if we want to have animal advocacy advisory boards. Okay, so far for that example, we talked a lot about now what we can do with institutions that already exist in our country, and what we can do if we don't have any institutions existing, where we can actually start. And now I'll move on to the topic of creating new institutions. So this is also just a really brave overview, but the first step would actually be to recognize the debate within political theory. So like I said, there was this example from Alistair Cochrane saying, okay, we need to have reserved seats in parliament that are elected by, where animal representatives sit, that are elected by citizen assemblies. So this may sound like a really radical idea, and we have to, I think, contextualize this idea within the context of ideal theory. So many ideas from political theory are from ideal theory, and they can't be applied to our realities like one-on-one. So maybe we need to develop them further. So in order to do this, we need to create discourse. So we need to create places where discussion is possible, that we can actually consider these ideas and debates within political theory as impulses to actually develop them further, and then ultimately design and demand new institutions. So how can we actually, what could these places where discussion is possible could look like? I have some initial ideas for you for that. So this may sound really simplistic, but the first initial idea would be just to create places to discuss in your own organization, in your own party, in your own group of activists, that you just create places to talk about how could actually animal representation look like. To maybe organize workshops. I do workshops, also Animal Society does a lot of things. They have presentations online. So just talk about, just start a discussion within your group to actually also develop your own position on that, and to create just to start a discussion, then you can look how you go, where you're going. The second idea is a more institutional idea, which is citizen assemblies. You may have heard of them. So citizen assemblies are basically a randomly selected sample of citizens come together and deliberate about an issue, and they will also get receive input from experts. So maybe, for instance, political theorists will give input of the current debate in political theory, and then just these randomly selected people will talk about it and will talk what could animal representation look like. And I think it's interesting to say that citizen assemblies can be organized by the government, but they could also be organized by civil society. So we as a movement, or maybe more bigger organizations, they could actually also organize a citizen assembly. The last idea may be a more German-specific one. This is a demand that Animal Society has also advocating for, which is to convene an Enquete-Kommission. So Enquete-Kommission is basically a commission that conducts an inquiry, and if a quarter of MPs, of member of parliaments, actually says we want to have this commission, then the parliament is obliged to actually conduct one. And this commission basically discusses an issue, takes measures, or develops measures, and also raise public awareness. So if a quarter of member of parliaments actually would say we want to have a commission on the topic of animal representation, we would have this commission out of half of experts and half of member of parliaments coming together and actually talking about what could animal representation within our country look like. And like you can see on the slides, I have like two more bigger terms there, which is accessibility and intersectionality. I do want to mention them briefly because I believe when we talk about creating places to discuss, but also discussing the content in itself, I believe both of them are important. So with accessibility, I want to say that if we create places to discuss, especially political theory, like political theory is done in mostly really academic English language, which in itself is highly excluding many people. So I believe there lies a responsibility on political theorists, which I consider myself, to actually work towards making theory in itself also a bigger issue in science, obviously, but making also this debate more accessible to people. But I believe there can also be a responsibility for organizations working with that topic to make actually this topic more accessible when they start a discussion and when they try to communicate their ideas. And the second term was intersectionality. So I believe that the whole discussion of are animals sufficiently represented? No, they are probably not. Also not only concerns animals, but many non-human and human groups within our societies. So many marginalized groups are not sufficiently represented in our democracies. Just for instance, also in political theory, there's a huge debate how to actually represent future non-human and human generations. There is a debate how to represent children. We talk a lot about how to represent nature and rivers and so on. But there are also, for example, in Germany and I believe across Europe, a huge amount of people who institutionally are not allowed to vote, but actually, like in Germany, live longer than 5 years in our country, but still are not allowed to vote because they don't receive citizenship. And also there is a group of disabled people that may be allowed to vote, but many, like really many informal barriers across Europe prevent them from voting and from actually taking part. So just to give you an overview of many topics that actually concern the question, are these groups represented sufficiently and what we can actually do to change that? So I believe when we create places to discuss how animal representation could look like, I believe there lies the potential of solidarity within other struggles of representation in our democracies. Okay, moving on to from creating places to discuss to actually also explore some examples. And I believe in order to design new institutions, we could also explore impulses in practice. And so you as an organization or party can demand or implement yourself pilot studies, for instance. So I have one example. There was a study about interspecies deliberation and animal agency at the Vine Sanctuary conducted by, I believe, Sue Donaldson, Charlotte Blattner, and I believe Wilcox, when I'm right. And they were like analyzing and looking how actually the structure of the specific sanctuary actually enables animal agency and supports animal agency and deliberation and their autonomous decision of animals living there, but also interspecies decision making and like living together. So just to give you a quick example. And I believe from the ideas from political theory, one that is what I believe is the best to actually explore in pilot studies is microboards. So when I talk about microboards, many people have not really understand what it is. I still will try this to explain it. So microboards are an idea from disability studies, and they are actually already implemented successfully in practice. And Sue Donaldson uses this idea and applies it to the representation of animals. So microbots basically are a group of, I don't know, 5 to 6 people, can also be 3 people, just a small group coming together and supporting an individual in their daily life so they can make more autonomous decision. So basically Sue Donaldson applies it to animals and say, we live closely with domesticated animals. So for example, we take a domesticated animals and there are people already living together with it, and they come together, support the specific individual in their autonomy, and also because they interact so closely, they know the interest of them, and they can then actually represent them to the outside. So Sue Donaldson says that this idea could be then in addition to more formal institutions in parliament. And also we could do our creative and artistic projects. So for instance, TM Focus, an organization from Switzerland, they have a fictional animal party at a demonstration, or there's the board game Zoocracy. I don't know if it's a good board game, but it's about like different species deliberating with each other. And there's also an example of an organization, Organismendemokratie. They're organizing like parliaments of organisms. You can just look into it more on Google. It's about like representing different organisms such as worms, herbs and grasses, bacteria, mushrooms, and so on. I think it's a quite nice example. And it's in 7 cities, including, for instance, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. So if you want to look more into it, I think it's a great example. Coming to my finishing thoughts already, so this was just a spectrum of how you could create your own position and how we could actually work towards establishing animal representation. In the end, I do want to say that we as humans are not in the position to define the political, so like the theorist Agamben actually said that the foundational acts of Western politics is an attempt to separate animal life from proper human life. So if we create places to discuss how animal representation we look like, I believe this is one of the most important things we need to keep in mind, that we are not in the position to define what politics is and what the political is and to exclude others, but we should not predetermine what political decision making is, but we should explore it. So we should keep in mind the question that Will Kimlicka asks, in which politics do animals engage themselves in? So just to have this in mind, we do not predetermine, but we do explore, and we should create actually spaces where animals are included in the decision making. So not only politics on behalf of animals, but politics by animals and politics with animals. So these are also big concepts, which this presentation was not about, but if you do want to read more about them, Eva Meyer, Sue Donaldson, Will Kimlicka have written a lot about it. Actually coming to my recommendations, so if you want to know more about animal language and interspecies deliberation, you can read more in the book When Animals Speak Towards Interspecies Democracy by Eva Meyer. I also want to recommend the YouTube channel from Animal Society because they have several really good talks on there. And the last 2 recommendations are in German. So the podcast from Animal Society, where also there's one episode with me talking more specifically about institutional ideas, like theoretically, and also the study that I co-authored with Philipp von Gaal, which will be published soon, and I will try to let you know when and where. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you, Alli. Right, are there any questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I had a question about, because you mentioned obviously there's a difference pretty much with anything between theory and practice. And I wondered, what do you foresee being the sort of potentially largest issues with going from theory to practice? And do you see any differences in those big issues depending on the political system? Because obviously different areas of the world have different political systems.
I believe one of the biggest issue is that, at least from my impressions, many organizations, also the really big organizations in Germany, the big parties, they do not know that this debate exists. They do not know that actually in political theory for years there has been a debate about this, about how animal representation could look like. So I believe what is responsibly partly for this is definitely that political theorists are in their academic bubble. So they do their conferences where we also go and join and listen to them. But what stays in my mind is always there's this room of so many like prominent theorists, and they talk the whole day, they do their presentations, but in the end there's no really exchange or strategy or coming together and discuss what is our strategy, like what can political theory provide as a to a movement. So I think at least in my opinion, one big issue would be that political theorists also themselves like consider themselves as activists and actually try to think about what can our ideas do outside of theory. So I think this is at least part of the answer. And the other part of the question was if it
It was, do you foresee different political systems having different barriers from going from theory to practice?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I believe it depends on what institutions exist in that country. So in Germany, we do have these 3 examples I gave. And like Tierschutzbeiräte and animal ombudspersons, they may not be really powerful institutions, but there are so many ways of how to make them more effective. But there are other countries where these kinds of institutions do not exist. So then starting to actually implement ones, I think would be harder rather than already having ones and working towards strengthening them and also using them and working together to establish new ones. So I believe it's definitely harder if you don't have any. But like I said, maybe the best way would start to look at, are there other already successfully implemented institutions that may represent children or represent future generations, and then apply it to animals. So that would be my starting point in a country where like non-institutions for animals exist.
Thanks, Ali, for the great presentation. I have 2 short questions, if I may. First one would be, could you define what is a political act? And maybe give an example of a more obvious political act by an animal. And the second question is also like a reflection that I have, to what extent individual activism, such as vegan outreach or like focusing on consumption of certain products, is competing with more political activism.
So what is a political act? I could like probably write a thesis on that. I don't know if I can answer that really good in like short term. I believe the political is like really connected with representation, and political representation is to make an interest visible in a specific space. So regarding our democracies, it's within parliament, but making like interests visible is also possible in more informal ways, like organizations do to raise public awareness. So this is also a form of representation. I believe a political act is basically representing like an interest, or representing a group, or at least claiming to represent them. I mean, then in the second step, you would actually look, is this presentation good? But because there's also bad representation, obviously. And then the second step would, if you represent them, then you get to a point of decision making and finding compromises. And I believe that political decision making, at least nowadays, is really human exclusive. I mean, the parliament is, designed architecturally to be human exclusive. Like I can't imagine politicians interacting with different species there. So maybe the potential in also more interspecies deliberation or political acts of animals lies in more the informal sphere of politics. So the informal sphere of politics, like the formal sphere are like these formal institutions, parliament, ministries and so on. And the informal sphere of politics, according to political theory, is, for instance, within the city, like public places, or places where you encounter each other, where citizens encounter each other. So I believe there lies the potential for an animal act, like a political act of an animal. And I do not remember your second question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. About to what extent focusing on the individuals, convincing people to buy or boycott certain products. So consumerism or vegan outreach, for example, is competing with a more political approach, animal politics.
I hope they're not competing with each other. So in the beginning, I tried to say that like formal politics is one way among many. So with like phrasing it this way, I just tried to avoid this competition because I don't think this competition is helpful. I believe that both ways, like all of the ways like civil disobedience or making people aware about veganism, animal rights, and also the more institutional approaches that were more the focus of this talk, I believe that all of them are important because obviously in the end to establish new institutions we also need to support from the public basically, or I believe in. So I believe it goes hand in hand, or at least I hope it will go hand in hand. Thanks for your question.
Okay, so we do have a question from the online audience. Could you
the question was rather similar. It's Melda online. She says, "Hi Ali, thanks for the brilliant talk. Do you think non-human animals' representation in formal politics is possible without granting them some form of citizenship rights first?"
That's a good question. So citizenship has been discussed in political theory prominently by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka. They wrote a book about this, Zoopolis, if you have read it. I don't have a finished standpoint on this because, so their argument is basically that domesticated animals in our democracy should be granted citizenship. I mean, citizenship in itself is a violent institution. It's used to exclude people from the community and to deny rights. So maybe if we radically think about it, maybe we come to the solution that we need to abolish citizenship. But apart from that discussion, I believe in my opinion, I believe I'm in line with Peter Niesen. Peter Niesen is also a political theorist, and he argues that we should define this right to representation in a really slim way and not presuming a huge amount of animal rights, which Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka does, because how can we actually establish animal rights if we presume them? So if we presume them for the representation, how can we establish them? Because we need these animal representatives to then step by step establish these rights. So that would be my answer, but in the discussion there are other opinions on that.
All right, thank you so much, Ali, for your presentation. We are out of time, but I want to say thank you so much. And
thank you for listening.